Yes, and on the topic of Australian politics, last week's episode was on the Australian
Spendathon.
Spendathon budget.
So I thought this week we might have a quick look at the official budget in reply speech from Labor leader Anthony Albanese. Now, for those of you who don't know Albo, as he's called, he's very well known for constantly mentioning his humble upbringings in every speech.
I grew up in public housing. I'm proud of it. I grew up in public housing in Camperdown, the son of a single mum. I was raised here in Sydney in council housing by my mum.
So, right, here he is, the budget in reply speech, possibly the biggest political speech of the year. What's he going to open with?
I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Yeah. My fellow Australians, I grew up in a council house in Camperdown, the only son of a single mum.
Bam, yes, just like Outcast if they were to open with Hey-Ya or Cold Chisel with K-San. He's leading with the hits. He's giving us that sweet log cabin story right at the top of the set list so we can all get home early. Good stuff, Albo. All right, first up, the Conservative coalition government's budget on the Tuesday was basically a Labor budget. They funded aged care, they funded childcare, they funded the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So at the budget reply speech, Albanese largely had nothing much to add except for this new housing policy.
I'm proud to say that Labor in government will create a $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund with the annual investment return to build social and affordable housing and create thousands of jobs.
Yes, $10 billion for affordable housing. Now, if I just plug that into my housing price calculator here, 12 studio apartments in Sydney. Good job. No, seriously though, this being an investment in social housing for poorer Australians meant that Scott Morrison was, of course, against it.
The Prime Minister contrasting it with an ideological difference. Investment in social housing versus
the Menzian mission of home ownership.
Driven through programs like Home Builder.
We're not saying, sit down, we'll do it. We'll say, we'll stand next to you and we'll do it together.
Yes, what he's basically saying is we'll stand next to you while you can't afford anything because only 1.2% of rentals in Australia are affordable for someone on the minimum wage and 0% of rentals are affordable for someone on the disability support pension or youth allowance. Not to mention that to afford an average Sydney house mortgage, you need a household income of $170,000 a year. I mean, it almost looks like Scott Morrison views housing as a get-rich-quick scheme for his mates instead of a basic fundamental human right so you don't freeze to death or get rained on. But hey, what would I know? The only other big policy announcement from Labor in the budget reply speech was this.
My Labor government will establish the Startup Year program to help drive innovation and increase links between universities and entrepreneurs.
But it turns out this wasn't a new policy, as the government like to point out.
Recycling will also figure, not as a policy, but a practice. Recycling, Bill Shorten's 2015 innovation policy, providing start-up loans to 2,000 student innovators and even recycling the name, Startup Year.
Imagine the lack of innovation it takes not even to be able to come up with a new name for the old policy.
Yeah, how dare Albo recycle one old policy? Meanwhile, the coalition only have one policy they recycle over and over again.
Tax cuts, less tax, lower taxes.
In the end, Albanese also got a bit reflective.
Mr. Speaker, every one of us hopes to grow old.
Yes, Albo, but unless you figure out how to attack the Conservatives while simultaneously winning over financially precarious younger workers and fiscally conservative older Australians, you won't be growing old in the lodge. You'll be growing old
in a council house in Camperdown.
Newsfighters, Australia's funniest news summary podcast.